Hey guys, tonight we begin with a confession. Somewhere beneath the Mediterranean Sea, about 6.5 kilometers off the coast of Egypt, there is an entire city, not a shipwreck. Not a scattered handful of pottery shards that archaeologists get unreasonably excited about. An entire city. Temples, harbors, colossal statues, streets, canals, ships, all of it resting on the sea floor in Aboukir Bay, draped in silt and silence, as if someone had simply pressed pause on one of the ancient world's most important port cities and then walked away for 1,200 years. The city is called Heracleion. The Egyptians called it Thonis. And for centuries, the only evidence it had ever existed at all was a handful of passing references in ancient texts and the quiet insistence of the sea that it was keeping something down there, if only someone would bother to look. So, before we descend, and we are going to descend, slowly, the way the city itself once did, I'd ask you to do the usual things. Like this video if you find it worth your time. Subscribe if you haven't already. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because I'm genuinely curious how far this reaches. And then, if you're settling in for the night, do what feels right. Dim the lights. Put on headphones if you have them. Maybe turn on a fan for the ambient noise. Something that sounds a little like water moving in the dark. Because tonight's story is not loud. It is not dramatic in the way we've been trained to expect. There are no volcanic eruptions here, no walls of fire, no armies at the gates. What happened to Heracleion was quieter than that, and in many ways, stranger. A city that thrived for centuries simply sank, slowly, gently, almost politely, and then the world forgot it had ever been there at all. Until one day, a French archaeologist, looking for something else entirely, put his hand on a stone face 5 meters tall, resting on its back in the mud, and realized that the sea had been holding a secret so large it could be measured in square kilometers. That is the conventional framing, the one you will find in headlines and documentary trailers and the breathless captions beneath photographs of divers hovering over granite faces in green water. The lost city, Egypt's Atlantis, the city that disappeared. These phrases sell tickets and generate clicks, and they are, in the most fundamental sense, wrong. Heracleion did not disappear. It did not vanish. It was not lost in the way that a key is lost or a memory is lost. It moved. It moved somewhere we were not yet willing to look beneath the surface, into the dark, into the quiet. And when we finally found it, after more than a millennium of absence from human awareness, it had been waiting there the whole time, perfectly patient, as if it always knew we would come. What I want to argue tonight, and I want to argue it carefully, because the evidence deserves care, is that the submersion of Heracleion was not simply a catastrophe. It was, paradoxically, an act of preservation. The same water that drowned the city also cradled it. The same silt that buried its temples also sealed them against the forces that destroy every ruin on land: wind, rain, frost, the slow chemical assault of open air, and above all, the most destructive force in archaeological history, US. Human beings. Looters, builders, quarriers, conquerors, developers, and well-meaning restorers who sometimes do more damage than the centuries they're trying to undo. Heracleion escaped all of that. It traded silence for survival. It exchanged the surface world's memory for the sea floor's protection. And when Franck Goddio and his team finally reached it, in the year 2000, they found not a ruin in the way we usually understand that word, but something closer to a time capsule, a city frozen in the long, slow moment of its own departure, its temples intact enough to match ancient descriptions, its statues unlooted because no one had known they were there, its harbor still full of ships that had never been salvaged because the harbor itself had ceased to exist in human reckoning. Fire does not preserve. War does not preserve. Time, left to its own devices on dry land, does not preserve. But water cold, dark, oxygen poor, silt-heavy water preserves with an almost custodial tenderness, and so Heracleion endured, not despite its drowning, but because of it. That is the counterintuitive heart of this story. That is the thread we will follow all the way down. Part 1. A city that history forgot. Let us begin with what Heracleion was before it became what it is now. In the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, if you were a Greek merchant, and a great many people in the ancient Mediterranean were Greek merchants, because the Greeks treated commerce the way modern nations treat social media, as something simultaneously indispensable and slightly undignified, you could not simply sail into Egypt and begin doing business. Egypt was not an open market. Egypt was a civilization that had been regulating foreign trade since before Greece had figured out the alphabet, and it was not about to let a boatload of Aegean olive oil wash up on the Nile Delta without paperwork. There was a system, there were customs, there were taxes, and there was, above all, a single mandatory port of entry through which all Greek trade had to pass before it could proceed upriver toward Memphis or Thebes or any of the inland cities where the real money was. That port was Heracleion. The Greeks called it Heracleion, after Heracles, the hero who in mythology had once visited Egypt and left enough of an impression that the locals named a city after him. Which is the kind of origin story that tells you more about Greek self-regard than about actual history. The Egyptians called it Thonis, a name that appears in records dating back to at least the 6th century BCE, and possibly earlier. The dual naming Thonis Heracleion, as scholars now write it, with the diplomatic hyphen that acknowledges both cultures without offending, either tells you something important about the city right from the start. It was a place where two civilizations met. Not in the abstract, textbook sense of cultural contact, but in the concrete, daily, dockside sense of Egyptian customs officials inspecting Greek cargo while Greek sailors haggled over mooring fees in a harbor that smelled of fish and incense, and the particular kind of mutual suspicion that accompanies all international commerce. Herodotus, the Greek historian who visited Egypt around 450 BCE and wrote about it with the wide-eyed enthusiasm of a man who has just discovered that the world is larger and stranger than his hometown had led him to believe, mentions Heracleion. He describes it as a city at the mouth of the canopic branch of the Nile, a place of temples and trade, a gateway. He does not describe it as small. He does not describe it as unimportant. He describes it as the kind of place where things happen, where goods change hands, where gods are honored, where the business of civilization is conducted with the particular seriousness that the ancient world reserved for religion and revenue, which were often the same thing. And then, at some point, the ancient sources stop mentioning it. Not suddenly, not with the dramatic finality of a city destroyed by conquest or plague. The references simply thin out, like a conversation that trails off because both parties have gotten distracted. By the time Alexandria was founded in 331 BCE, just 20 miles to the southwest, close enough to be insulting Heracleion, was already declining. By the Roman period, it was a shadow. By the late Roman and early Islamic periods, it was barely a footnote, and by the medieval period, it had passed out of living memory entirely, surviving only as a name in old texts that scholars increasingly suspected might refer to a place that had never quite existed in the way the ancients described. Perhaps Heracleion was an exaggeration. Perhaps it was a conflation of several smaller settlements. Perhaps Herodotus, who was known to embellish, had simply made it sound grander than it was. The scholarly consensus, for centuries, was a collective shrug. Heracleion was probably real, in some diminished sense, but it was gone, and there was no particular reason to go looking for it. The world had moved on. Alexandria had inherited its role. The Nile Delta had rearranged itself, as deltas do, and whatever had once been at the mouth of the canopic branch was now somewhere beneath the shallow waters of Aboukir Bay, inaccessible and, frankly, not worth the trouble. This is how history forgets. Not with a decisive act of erasure, but with a slow, almost gentle withdrawal of attention. The world stops calling. The invitations stop arriving. And eventually, the city that was once the front door to one of the greatest civilizations on Earth becomes a name that scholars argue about in footnotes, if they mention it at all. Heracleion was not destroyed by an enemy. It was not burned or sacked or conquered. It was simply replaced, and then it was forgotten, and then the sea closed over it like a hand closing over a coin, and for 1,200 years, that was that. Part 2. The Man Who Found It. Franck Goddio was not looking for Heracleion. This is important, and it is also, in its way, the most archaeologically honest thing about the discovery. The greatest finds in the history of the discipline have an awkward habit of happening sideways, not because someone set out to find a specific thing, but because someone was looking for something else and stumbled into a story far larger than the one they had planned. Howard Carter was methodical. He spent years searching for Tutankhamun's tomb with deliberate intent. But Heinrich Schliemann found Troy while half the academic world thought he was a crank, and the Rosetta Stone was discovered by a French soldier digging a fort. Archaeology, for all its careful methodology, has a soft spot for accidents. Goddio is a French underwater archaeologist, and in the mid-1990s, he was the founder and president of the European Institute for Underwater Archaeology, known by its French acronym IEASM. His primary interest at the time was the maritime history of Egypt's Mediterranean coast, and his specific quarry was a set of French warships from the 18th century vessels from Napoleon's fleet that had been sunk during the Battle of the Nile in 1798. He was working in Aboukir Bay, the same shallow, silty stretch of water where Admiral Nelson had handed Napoleon one of his most decisive naval defeats. And he was using advanced survey technology, side-scan sonar, sub-bottom profilers, nuclear magnetic resonance magnetometers, to map the seafloor in a systematic grid. The technology was state-of-the-art. The funding was international, supported in part by the Hilti Foundation, a Liechtenstein-based organization that has quietly become one of the most important patrons of underwater archaeology in the world, which is the kind of sentence that reminds you how strange the modern funding of knowledge can be. What the sonar found was not French warships. Or rather, it found those too, eventually. But what it found first, spread across the sea floor in a pattern too large and too structured to be debris from a naval battle, was something else. Anomalies. Shapes. Walls. The outlines of structures that had no business being 6.5 kilometers offshore in water that was, at most, 10 meters deep. Goddio and his team had been mapping the bay methodically since 1996, and by 1999, the data was becoming undeniable. There was something enormous down there. Not a shipwreck, not a scattered field of artifacts. Something that had foundations. Something that had streets. Something that had, unmistakably, the footprint of a city. In the year 2000, divers went down. What they found, and I want to describe this carefully, because the moment deserves care, was Heracleion. Not a piece of it, not a suggestion of it. The city itself, spread across approximately 11 by 15 kilometers of seafloor in Aboukir Bay, its temple district identifiable, its harbor still discernible, its canal network still traceable in the sediment, and its monumental statuary still lying where it had fallen when the ground beneath it gave way, centuries before anyone alive had been born. The divers found a colossal statue of a pharaoh, over 5 meters tall, lying on its back in the silt. They found the remains of a massive temple. They found walls. They found columns. They found, in the murky green half-light of the shallow Mediterranean, an entire city that had been missing from human knowledge for more than a millennium, resting on the sea floor, with the peculiar composure of something that had never expected to be disturbed. Goddio, to his credit, understood immediately what he had. He also understood, with the pragmatism of a man who has spent decades navigating the politics of international archaeology, that a discovery of this magnitude required institutional support, governmental cooperation, and the kind of meticulous documentation that would make the find scientifically unassailable. He partnered with the Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities, now the Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities, and began what has become one of the longest-running and most productive underwater excavation projects in the history of the field. The work has continued, season after season, for over 2 decades. It is still ongoing. The city is still giving up its secrets, slowly, reluctantly, one dive at a time. And it all started because a man looking for Napoleon's ships found a pharaoh's face staring up at him from the mud. There is a lesson in that, though I'm not sure it's one that can be taught. Sometimes the thing you find is not the thing you were looking for. Sometimes the seafloor has its own agenda. Part 3. What lies beneath? Let me try to describe what it is like down there, because the description matters. It matters not just for the information it conveys, but for the feeling it creates. And the feeling is part of the story. Aboukir Bay is not deep. That is the first thing to understand. The ruins of Heracleion lie in water that is, for the most part, between 6 and 10 meters deep, shallow enough that sunlight reaches the bottom on a clear day, filtered through the water column into a dim, greenish half-light that makes everything look like a memory of itself. The visibility is variable. The Nile Delta feeds sediment into the bay constantly, and the water can shift from reasonably clear to opaque in a matter of hours, depending on the current and the season. On a good day, a diver might see 15 meters. On a bad day, they might see 2. The silt is fine and easily disturbed. A careless fin stroke can turn the water around you into a cloud that takes minutes to settle, and in those minutes you are essentially blind, hovering in brownish nothing, waiting for the sea to forgive your clumsiness. But on the good days, on the days when the current is gentle, and the silt is settled, and the light is filtering down in pale shafts through the water, what you see is something that the human mind has difficulty categorizing. Because you are not looking at a ruin in any conventional sense. You are looking at a city that is underwater. And those two facts, city and underwater, do not belong together in the part of your brain that processes the world. And so, there is a moment, reportedly experienced by nearly every diver who has worked the site, where the mind simply stalls. It cannot make sense of what the eyes are seeing. A wall, down here. A column, down here. A face, a stone face, 5 meters from brow to chin, carved in red granite, staring upward through the water with the serene expression of someone who has been waiting a very long time and is in no particular hurry. The first major finds were in the Temple district, near what Goddio's team identified as the central sanctuary of the city. The Temple of Amun-Gereb, the Egyptian god Amun, in his local form, fused with the earth god Geb in a regional variation that tells you something about the theological creativity of ancient Heracleion, was the heart of the city's religious life, and its remains were among the first structures identified on the seafloor. The divers found walls. They found column bases. They found offering tables and ritual vessels, and, scattered in the sediment around the temple, a staggering quantity of small bronze figurines, images of Osiris, of Isis, of the sacred animals that populated the Egyptian divine bestiary. These objects had been placed carefully, deliberately, as offerings to the gods, and they were still there, lying in the exact positions where priests had set them down centuries ago, undisturbed by anything except the slow accumulation of marine sediment. Around the temple, the divers found the statuary, the colossal figures that have become the visual signature of Heracleion, the images you have probably already seen, if you have seen anything about this site at all. A pharaoh, over 5 meters tall, carved in red granite, lying supine in the silt with his arms at his sides and his face turned toward the surface, as if he had simply decided to lie down one afternoon and had not gotten up since. A queen, equally massive, in a similar position, and the god Hapi, the deity of the Nile flood, The annual inundation that was the lifeblood of Egyptian civilization, rendered in red granite, at a scale that suggests the people who carved him wanted to make absolutely sure the gods understood they were serious. Hapi lies on his back in the silt. His belly rounded, he was always depicted as a figure of abundance, well-fed, generous, overflowing, his expression calm, his stone body encrusted with the faint biological traces of centuries underwater, a thin film of marine growth, the ghosts of barnacles, the patina that water and time leave on everything they touch. These statues were not toppled by violence. There are no chisel marks of deliberate destruction, no signs of the iconoclasm that defaced so many Egyptian monuments on land. They fell because the ground beneath them gave way. They fell because the city sank, and as it sank, the heavy things, the stone things, the monumental things tipped and slid and came to rest in the positions where the divers found them. 2,000 years later, looking for all the world, like gods taking a nap, and around them, in every direction, the sea floor is littered with the evidence of a city that was once alive: pottery, anchors, coins, the remnants of wooden structures, dock pilings, ship hulls, building frames preserved in the anaerobic mud, metal objects green with patina, stone blocks that once formed walls and pavements, and the foundations of buildings where people lived and worked and argued about the price of grain. It is all there. It is all still there. And it is all underwater, in the dark, in the quiet, in the particular kind of stillness that exists only at the bottom of the sea, where sound travels differently, and light arrives already tired, and the only movement is the slow, hypnotic drift of sediment through water that has not been hurried in a very long time. That is what lies beneath. Not a ruin, a city, sleeping. Part 4. The geography of loss. How does a city drown? Not quickly, is the first answer. Not in a single night of catastrophe, not in one dramatic earthquake, not in a tsunami or a flood, or any of the sudden, cinematic disasters that make for good storytelling, but poor geology. Heracleion drowned slowly. It drowned over centuries. It drowned the way a conversation dies, not with a shout, but with a gradual trailing off, a slow loss of energy, a quiet acceptance that the thing which was once vigorous and alive has become something else, something that is still technically present, but no longer really functioning. The Nile Delta is one of the most geologically unstable landscapes on Earth. This is not a metaphor. It is a statement of sedimentary fact. The delta is built from thousands of years of Nile flood deposits, layer upon layer of fine silt and clay, carried downriver from the Ethiopian highlands and deposited at the river's mouth in a broad, flat fan that extends into the Mediterranean. This sediment is soft. It is water-saturated. It is, in engineering terms, unconsolidated, which is a polite way of saying that it is not the kind of ground you want to build a city on if you are hoping that city will remain at its current elevation indefinitely. Heracleion was built on this sediment. It was built at the mouth of the canopic branch of the Nile, on low-lying land that was barely above sea level to begin with, in a region where the water table was high and the ground was, to put it bluntly, more water than earth. The city's engineers understood this. The Canal Network, the harbor infrastructure, the way the city was organized around waterways rather than roads, all of this suggests a sophisticated understanding of the challenges of building on a delta. The people of Heracleion knew they were building on soft ground. They built accordingly. They built with water, around water, in accommodation with water. What they could not have known, because the timescale was too long for any single generation to perceive, was that the ground itself was sinking. The process is called subsidence, and it is the slow, relentless settling of sedimentary deposits under their own weight and the weight of everything built upon them. In the Nile Delta, subsidence is a constant. The ground is always sinking, millimeter by millimeter, year by year, in a process so gradual that it is essentially invisible on a human timescale. You cannot feel it, you cannot see it, you can only measure it, and the ancient Egyptians did not have the instruments to do so. What they had was the experience of living in a city where the water seemed to be getting a little higher each decade, where the floods seemed to reach a little further, where the foundations of buildings seemed to settle a little deeper into the mud, slow enough to adapt to, slow enough to normalize, too slow to flee from, until it was too late. But subsidence alone did not drown Heracleion. The process was compounded by other forces, each one insufficient on its own, but devastating in combination. Rising sea levels in the eastern Mediterranean, driven by long-term climatic shifts, gradually raised the baseline against which the sinking land was measured. Earthquakes, the eastern Mediterranean, is seismically active, and the Nile Delta sits near the boundary of the African and Eurasian tectonic plates, periodically accelerated the process, shaking the waterlogged sediment in a phenomenon called liquefaction, where saturated soil temporarily behaves like a liquid under seismic stress. When the ground liquefies, everything on it sinks. Buildings tilt, foundations crack. Heavy structures like, say, a 5-meter granite statue of a pharaoh punch downward into the softened earth like a boot into wet sand. And then there was the Nile itself, the canopic branch, which had once been the main navigable channel of the river, and the reason Heracleion existed where it did was shifting. Rivers on deltas do not hold still. They migrate laterally, abandoning old channels and carving new ones, in a process called avulsion that can redirect an entire river system over the course of a few centuries. As the canopic branch shifted and diminished, Heracleion lost not only its economic lifeline, the trade that depended on river access, but also the constant supply of fresh sediment that had, paradoxically, been helping to build up the land, even as the land was sinking. Without new sediment, the sinking accelerated, the land dropped, the water rose, and the city, caught between a retreating river and an advancing sea, began to go under. The process likely took centuries. Archaeological and geological evidence suggests that Heracleion experienced significant subsidence events in the 2nd century BCE and again in the 1st century CE, with further episodes of sinking continuing sporadically through the late Roman period and into the early Islamic period. The final submersion, the point at which the last remnants of the city disappeared beneath the waves, probably occurred sometime around the 8th century CE, give or take a century, which is the kind of margin of error that reminds you how imprecise our understanding of this process still is. By the time the sea closed over the last visible traces of Heracleion, no one was living there. The city had been abandoned long before it fully sank. Its population dispersed to higher ground, to other cities, to the relentless gravitational pull of Alexandria, which had been absorbing Heracleion's people and commerce for centuries. The drowning, when it finally happened, was of an empty city, a ghost city, a city that had already been dead, in every way that mattered to the people who had once called it home, before the water finished the job. And there is something in that sequence, the slow departure of people, followed by the slow arrival of water, that feels less like a catastrophe and more like a transition. As if the city, having served its purpose for the humans who built it, was being reclaimed by the element it had always been closest to. Water gave Heracleion its life. Water sustained its economy. Water filled its canals and floated its ships and carried the goods that made it rich. And then water took it back. Not violently, not cruelly, just inevitably, the way water always does. Part 5. Egypt's Gatekeeping Port. To understand what was lost when Heracleion sank, you have to understand what it was when it floated. And what it was, in the simplest terms, was a toll booth. The most magnificent, architecturally ambitious, religiously significant toll booth in the ancient Mediterranean, but a toll booth nonetheless. Heracleion existed because Egypt wanted to control who entered its territory by sea, what they brought with them, and how much they paid for the privilege. The city was not a destination. It was a checkpoint, a gateway, the front door to a civilization that had been managing its borders with bureaucratic precision since before the Greeks had learned to write. From at least the 7th century BCE, and possibly earlier, all Greek maritime trade entering Egypt was required to pass through the port of Thonis Heracleion. This was not a suggestion, it was a law, enforced by the pharaonic state with the kind of administrative rigor that makes modern customs agencies look permissive. Ships arriving from the Aegean, from the Levant, from the islands and coastal cities of the eastern Mediterranean were directed to Heracleion's harbor, where they were inspected, taxed, and either granted permission to proceed upriver or turned away. The city had customs houses. It had warehouses for storing taxed goods. It had officials whose job was to assess the value of incoming cargo and extract the appropriate percentage for the Egyptian treasury. It had, in other words, all the unglamorous infrastructure of state-controlled commerce, and it performed this function with the efficiency of a civilization that had been running a centralized economy for 2,000 years. The tax regime was significant. Ancient sources suggest that a portion of all trade revenue collected at Heracleion was directed to the temple of the goddess Neith at Sais, the capital of the 26th dynasty pharaohs who oversaw much of Heracleion's golden age. This tells you something about the intertwining of commerce and religion. In ancient Egypt, the taxes you paid at the docks literally funded the gods, which gave the whole system a theological authority that made it very difficult to argue with. You were not just paying a tariff, you were making an offering. Try evading that. But Heracleion was more than a customs post. It was a transshipment hub, a place where goods changed vessels, where cargo was transferred from seagoing ships to the smaller riverboats that could navigate the Nile's shallower channels, where Greek olive oil and wine were unloaded, and Egyptian grain and papyrus and linen were loaded in their place. The harbor was enormous. The archaeological evidence suggests a main harbor basin large enough to accommodate dozens of ships simultaneously, with additional anchorages and canal berths extending into the city's interior. The Canal Network was the city's circulatory system, a web of waterways that allowed goods to move from the harbor to warehouses to processing facilities to the river channel without ever touching a road. Heracleion was, in this sense, a city designed for the movement of things. Its streets were water. Its highways were canals. Its entire urban plan was oriented around the logistics of getting stuff from Point A, which was a Greek ship in the harbor, to Point B, which was a barge headed upriver toward the Egyptian heartland. The economic power this conferred was substantial. For centuries, Heracleion was the bottleneck through which all Greek-Egyptian trade had to flow, and bottlenecks, as any economist will tell you, are where the money accumulates. The city grew wealthy. Its temples grew grand. Its harbor grew crowded. Its bureaucracy grew elaborate. And the whole system worked, beautifully and profitably, right up until the moment when Alexander the Great decided to build a new city 20 miles down the coast and render the entire arrangement obsolete. But we will get to Alexandria later. For now, understand this. Heracleion was not a backwater. It was not a minor port. It was the front gate to Egypt, and for centuries, no one got in without passing through it, paying the fee, and receiving the stamp. The city that the sea swallowed was not a village. It was an engine of commerce, of taxation, of international exchange, of the vast and intricate machinery by which two great civilizations, Greece and Egypt, conducted their business with each other across the waters of the eastern Mediterranean. That engine is now on the sea floor. Its gears are silt-clogged. Its docks are draped in marine growth. Its customs houses are ruins. But its footprint is still there, still legible, still speaking to anyone willing to descend into the dark and listen. Part 6. The Temple of Amun-Gereb. At the center of Heracleion, there was a temple. This is not surprising. At the center of every important Egyptian city, there was a temple. The Egyptians did not separate the sacred from the civic, the way modern societies attempt to. Their cities were organized around their gods, the way a body is organized around a spine. The temple was not an addition to the city, it was the reason for the city. Everything else, the harbor, the customs houses, the warehouses, the residences, existed in relation to it, oriented toward it, justified by it. The temple at Heracleion was dedicated to Amun-Gereb, a local form of the great god Amun merged with Geb, the god of the earth. This syncretic combination, Amun, the king of gods, joined with Geb, the personification of the land itself, tells you something about what the people of Heracleion believed they were living on. Not just earth, but sacred earth. Earth that was a manifestation of the divine, earth that belonged to the gods and was merely lent to the humans who built upon it. A theological position that takes on a certain dark irony when you consider that the earth in question eventually liquefied and gave the city back to the water. The temple was grand. Ancient texts describe it as a major center of worship, a place where the great festivals of the Egyptian religious calendar were observed with appropriate pomp and expenditure. The pharaoh himself, or more precisely, the pharaoh's ritual representatives, since the pharaoh could not be everywhere at once, even in theory, performed ceremonies here. There is textual evidence suggesting that certain coronation rites, or rites associated with the legitimation of pharaonic authority, took place at the Temple of Amun in Heracleion, which would place this temple among the most politically significant religious sites in all of Egypt. To be crowned here, or to have your coronation ritually confirmed here, was to have your authority endorsed not just by the gods of the capital, but by the gods of the border, the gods of the threshold, the gods who watched over the place where Egypt met the sea and the world beyond. When Goddio's team found the temple district on the sea floor of Aboukir Bay, the correlation between what they saw and what the ancient text described was, in the words of the excavators, remarkably close. The temple's general layout, its orientation, its position relative to the harbor and the main canal, all of these matched the textual record with a precision that is unusual in archaeology, where ancient descriptions and physical evidence often have the kind of relationship that a movie has to the book it was based on, recognizably related, but full of discrepancies. The remains of the temple include stone blocks from its walls and columns, fragments of its decorative elements, and a substantial collection of ritual objects found in and around the sanctuary. These objects, bronze figurines of Osiris, offering dishes, sacred implements, amulets, and small votive statues, were the tools of religious practice, the physical vocabulary through which the priests of Amun-Gereb communicated with the divine. They were found scattered in the sediment around the temple's footprint, some still in what appear to be their original positions, others displaced by the subsidence events that gradually pulled the temple downward into the softening earth. There is something particularly affecting about finding religious objects underwater. A warehouse full of trade goods on the sea floor is interesting. A harbor full of shipwrecks is dramatic. But a temple full of offerings, objects placed there by human hands in acts of devotion, objects that represent not commerce or politics, but faith, the most private and least rational of human impulses, carries a different weight. These bronze figurines of Osiris, each one cast by a craftsman and purchased by a worshipper, and carried to the temple and placed before the god with a prayer that we will never know the words to, are not just artifacts. They are the residue of hope, of fear, of the desperate, beautiful, absurd human need to believe that someone, somewhere, is listening. The god, of course, did not respond. The temple sank. The offerings went with it. And now they rest in the silt, still arranged around the footprint of a sanctuary that no longer stands, still facing the direction of a god who, if he was ever present, departed long before the water arrived. The Temple of Amun-Gereb was built to last forever. And in a sense, it has. It simply did so in a place and in a manner that its builders never anticipated. The gods work in mysterious ways. The seafloor works in more mysterious ones. Part 7. Gods on the Sea Floor. Mini documentary, The God on His Back. Let us pause here and look closely at one object, one statue, because sometimes the best way to understand a city is not to survey it from above, but to sit with a single artifact and let it speak. The statue of Hapi is 5 meters and 40 centimeters tall. It is carved from red granite, a stone quarried from the region of Aswan, nearly 1,000 kilometers upriver from where the statue was found. This means that the block of stone from which Hapi was carved was cut from a quarry in Upper Egypt, transported by barge down the entire length of the Nile, delivered to a workshop where it was shaped by craftsmen whose names we do not know, and then erected in the city of Heracleion at the mouth of the river, where it stood as a monumental declaration of theological and political intent. The logistics alone are staggering. The ancient Egyptians moved a boulder the size of a small building across 1,000 kilometers of river, carved it into the likeness of a god, and stood it upright in a city that would one day sink beneath the sea. If that is not a metaphor for the ambition and futility of human endeavor, I am not sure what qualifies. Hapi is the god of the Nile inundation, the annual flood that deposited the fertile silt upon which Egyptian agriculture, and therefore Egyptian civilization, depended. He is traditionally depicted as an androgynous figure, with a round belly and pendulous breasts, symbols of abundance and fertility, of a land so generously watered that it could feed not only its own population, but much of the ancient world besides. Hapi is not a warrior god. He is not a god of conquest or judgment. He is a god of plenty, a god of the good years. A god whose arrival, in the form of the rising Nile, was the most anticipated event in the Egyptian calendar, the difference between feast and famine, between civilization and dust. The statue was found lying on its back on the sea floor, face up, arms at its sides, in a posture that could be described as recumbent or, if you are feeling generous, at rest. The expression on the face is calm. The eyes are open. The lips are curved in the faint, enigmatic, almost smile that Egyptian sculptors favored for divine figures, a expression that conveys neither happiness nor sorrow, but something closer to knowledge, the serene, slightly unsettling composure of a being that knows something you do not. And here is what strikes me about this statue. Lying on its back in the mud of Aboukir Bay, Hapi is the god of the flood. He is the god of the water that rises. He is the god who sends the Nile over its banks and covers the land in life-giving silt, and he is now, himself, covered. He is beneath the water he once commanded. The god of the inundation has been inundated. The deity who personified the annual submersion of the land has been permanently submerged. There is an irony in this so precise that it feels almost intentional, as if the universe has a scriptwriter with a very dry sense of humor. But there is also something else, something that moves past irony into a kind of quiet dignity. Hapi is lying on the sea floor, but he is not destroyed. He is not broken. His features are intact. His body is whole. The centuries of submersion have left their mark, a patina, a thin coat of marine accretion, the softening that saltwater works on stone over long periods, but the statue is, by any reasonable standard, in remarkable condition. Better, almost certainly, than it would be if it had remained on land, exposed to wind and sand, and the depredations of human activity. On land, a 5-meter granite statue in a prominent location would have been a target for iconoclasts who wanted to destroy pagan imagery, for builders who wanted the stone, for collectors who wanted the prestige, for time itself, which grinds down everything it can reach. Underwater, none of those forces could touch it. The sea took the statue, and the sea protected it. And now it lies in the silt, the god of plenty, in a posture of repose, gazing up through 6 meters of water at a sky he can no longer see, wearing 12 centuries of ocean on his granite skin like a garment. When the divers found Hapi, when the beam of a dive light first swept across his face and revealed features that had not been seen by human eyes since approximately the 8th century CE, the effect was, by all accounts, profound. There is something about encountering a face in the dark. Something about the moment when your light catches stone and resolves it into features you recognize as intentionally human, intentionally divine, intentionally made to communicate something across the gulf of centuries. The diver is wearing neoprene and breathing compressed air. The statue was carved in an age when iron was still a relatively new technology, and yet they are looking at each other, in a sense, across that gap, connected by the simple fact of a human face rendered in stone and a human face behind a mask, and between them, only water. Hapi has been raised from the sea floor. He was lifted by Goddio's team, carefully, with the kind of engineering that the operation required, and he has been exhibited in museums in Paris, London, and elsewhere, where visitors queue to stand before him in well-lit galleries and read the placard that explains who he is and where he was found. And he is impressive on land, in a museum, under artificial light. But I think, and this is my opinion, for whatever it is worth, that he was more himself down there, in the dark, in the quiet. In the company of the water that he was, once upon a time, supposed to command. The god of the flood, resting at the bottom of the sea. There is no more perfect symbol of what Heracleion was, and what it became, and what it means. Part 8. The Stele that spoke. Mini documentary. The Stele in the silt. For centuries, scholars had a problem. Actually, scholars always have problems. It is more or less the defining characteristic of the profession, but this particular problem was both specific and frustrating. Ancient Greek sources referred to a city called Heracleion, at the mouth of the canopic Nile, an important port and religious center. Ancient Egyptian sources referred to a city called Thonis, at the mouth of the canopic Nile, an important port and religious center. Were these the same city? Were they two different cities in close proximity? Were one or both of them exaggerations or conflations, or the kind of geographical errors that ancient writers made with cheerful frequency because they did not have satellite imagery and had to rely on second-hand reports from sailors who were often drunk? The scholarly debate was genuine and long-running. Some argued that Thonis and Heracleion were clearly the same place, viewed through two different cultural lenses, the Egyptian name and the Greek name, for a single settlement, like Cologne and Cologne, or Mumbai and Bombay. Others argued for separate cities, close together but distinct, each serving a different function or population. The evidence was ambiguous. The texts were incomplete. The actual site was, inconveniently, underwater and undiscovered. And so the argument continued, as scholarly arguments do, sustained by its own momentum and the professional need to publish papers that disagree with other papers. And then, in the silt of Aboukir Bay, Goddio's team found a stone. The Decree of Naukratis Stele is a slab of dark stone granodiorite, to be specific, inscribed with hieroglyphic text, dating to the reign of Pharaoh Nectanebo I, who ruled Egypt from 380 to 362 BCE. The stele is essentially a royal decree, a legal document carved in stone, which was the ancient Egyptian equivalent of publishing a law in the Federal Register, except considerably more permanent and much heavier. The decree establishes a tax, a 10% levy, on Greek trade goods passing through the port, and directs the revenue to the Temple of Amun-Gereb at Sais. Standard pharaonic fiscal policy, in other words. Not particularly exciting, unless you are an economic historian, in which case it is riveting. But here is what made this stone one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 21st century. The text of the decree refers to the place where the stele was erected, and it calls that place Thonis Heracleion, both names, on the same stone, in the same inscription, written by the same scribes, in the same reign, as a matter of official record. The scholarly debate which had sustained careers and filled journal pages for generations, was settled in the time it took to read a line of hieroglyphs. Thonis and Heracleion were the same city. The same harbor, the same temple, the same customs apparatus, the same population, viewed by Egyptians and Greeks through their respective linguistic lenses and recorded in their respective traditions, but referring, always, to one place, one city. The city whose ruins now surrounded the stele, spread across the sea floor, in silent confirmation. A nearly identical stele had been found previously on land, at Naukratis, the Greek trading colony, further upriver, bearing the same decree. The existence of the land-based copy had long been known to scholars, but without the Heracleion copy, without the stele that actually stood in the city it described, the identification remained tentative. Finding the second stele, in situ, on the seafloor of the very city it named, was the archaeological equivalent of finding a building's name still mounted on its front door, definitive, unambiguous. The kind of evidence that closes arguments rather than opening them. The stele was found lying face down in the sediment, which is the position it had assumed when the temple in which it stood collapsed around it during one of the city's subsidence events. It had been lying there, face down, inscription pressed into the mud, for approximately 23 centuries. 23 centuries of silence, of darkness, of the slow accumulation of marine sediment over a text that contained the answer to a question that would not be asked for another 2,000 years. The question being, what was this city called? And the answer being, it was called what it was always called, by both the people who built it and the people who traded there. And it had been saying so the entire time, carved in stone, lying face down in the mud, waiting for someone to come along and turn it over. There is a patience to stone that is difficult to overstate. Stone does not forget. Stone does not revise. Stone does not lose interest, or change its mind, or decide that the question is no longer worth answering. Stone simply holds what was carved into it and waits for 23 centuries, in this case. And when the divers finally turned the stele over and read the inscription, the stone simply delivered its message as clearly and as definitively as if it had been carved yesterday. Because, to stone, 23 centuries is not a particularly long time. The Decree of Naukratis Stele is now one of the most celebrated artifacts from the Heracleion excavation. It has been exhibited, photographed, published, and discussed in virtually every major work on the site. And rightly so. It is the artifact that turned a legend back into a fact. It is the moment when Heracleion stopped being a scholarly question and became a scholarly answer. And it was found lying face down in the mud, keeping its secret in the most literal way possible, pressed against the earth, text hidden, silent as the water that covered it. Patience rewarded, as always, on the seafloor. Part 9. Greek and Egyptian, side by side. One of the most persistent bad habits in the study of the ancient world is the tendency to treat civilizations as if they were hermetically sealed containers, each one developing its culture in splendid isolation until some moment of contact, when ideas crossed from one to another like pathogens in a sneeze. The Greeks influenced the Egyptians, we are told. Or the Egyptians influenced the Greeks, as if influence were a one-directional force, a simple arrow on a diagram, rather than the messy, reciprocal, constantly negotiated process that it actually was. Heracleion, more than almost any other site in the ancient Mediterranean, demonstrates how inadequate this model is, because in Heracleion, Greek and Egyptian culture did not influence each other. They lived together, they occupied the same streets, the same harbor, the same commercial district, the same temple precinct. They were not adjacent, they were intertwined. And the archaeological evidence from the seafloor shows this with a specificity that no ancient text, however eloquent, could match. The artifacts recovered from Heracleion include Greek pottery, Attic black figure, and red figure vessels, the kind of finely decorated ceramics that were the prestige goods of the Greek world. Traded across the Mediterranean as luxury items and markers of cultural sophistication, they also include Egyptian ritual objects, bronze, Osiris, figurines, offering dishes inscribed with hieroglyphs, amulets in the shapes of sacred animals, and the characteristic Egyptian faience that was produced nowhere else with the same technical skill. These objects were found not in separate districts, not in neatly segregated Greek quarter and Egyptian quarter contexts, but together, mixed. In the same layers, in the same structures, in the same deposits. Greek wine amphorae lying next to Egyptian incense burners. Attic pottery in an Egyptian temple precinct. Egyptian amulets in what appears to be a Greek-style commercial building. The religious evidence is even more striking. Heracleion had temples honoring Egyptian gods, Amun-Gereb, chief among them, and it also had shrines or sacred spaces associated with Greek deities, including Heracles himself, after whom the Greeks named the city. The presence of both traditions, operating simultaneously in the same urban space, suggests not a simple tolerance of foreign religion, but an active, creative engagement with it. The priests of Amun did not merely allow the Greeks to worship Heracles nearby. The two systems existed in a relationship that was more intimate than mere coexistence, a relationship of comparison, equation, and theological conversation. The Greeks looked at Amun and saw something they could understand through the lens of their own Zeus. The Egyptians looked at Heracles and saw something they could understand through the lens of their own heroic figures. Neither side was simply borrowing from the other. Both were creating something new, a hybrid religious vocabulary that allowed two very different civilizations to share sacred space without either one having to surrender its identity. This process, which scholars call syncretism, a term that is accurate but insufficiently interesting, was not unique to Heracleion. It happened everywhere that Greeks and Egyptians coexisted, most notably in Ptolemaic Alexandria, where the entire religious system was deliberately engineered to appeal to both populations. But Heracleion offers evidence of this process at an earlier date and in a more organic context. Alexandria's syncretism was a top-down political project designed by the Ptolemaic dynasty to unify their kingdom. Heracleion's syncretism was bottom-up, the natural, unplanned result of two cultures living side by side in a port city where commerce required communication, and communication, over time, produced understanding. The small artifacts tell this story most vividly. A Greek oil lamp found near an Egyptian offering table, a set of lead weights used for measuring trade goods, inscribed in both Greek and Demotic Egyptian. A ceramic vessel of Greek manufacture containing residues consistent with Egyptian embalming materials. Each of these objects is, on its own, a minor curiosity. Together, they paint a picture of a city where the boundaries between cultures were not walls, but membranes, permeable, flexible, constantly negotiated. The people of Heracleion did not live in two separate worlds that happened to share a harbor. They lived in one world, a world that was both Greek and Egyptian, and, ultimately, neither a world that was simply Heracleion, a place with its own identity, its own logic, its own way of being human at the edge of the sea. That world is gone now. The sea took it, but the artifacts that survive, lying side by side on the seafloor, Greek and Egyptian, sacred and commercial, imported and local, still speak to the kind of cultural exchange that the ancient world practiced with a fluency that we, for all our talk of globalization, have not always managed to equal. Part 10. Ships in the Mud. The harbor of Heracleion has yielded more than 70 ancient shipwrecks. Let that number settle for a moment. 70. Not 7, not 17. More than 70 individual vessels, in varying states of preservation, found in the sediment of what was once one of the busiest harbors in the eastern Mediterranean. Some are little more than scattered planks, their wooden hulls long since dissolved by the biological and chemical processes that consume organic material in seawater, leaving only their metal fittings, nails, bolts, lead sheathing to mark where a ship once rested. Others are substantially intact, their hulls preserved in the anaerobic mud of the harbor floor, where the absence of oxygen slowed the decay of wood to a pace that allowed the sediment to seal them before they could disintegrate entirely. The ships span centuries. The earliest date to the 6th century BCE, the period of Heracleon's greatest commercial importance, when the harbor was the mandatory port of entry for all Greek trade entering Egypt. The latest date to the 2nd century BCE or later, by which time the harbor was already in decline, its role usurped by Alexandria, its waters slowly shallowing as subsidence brought the city closer and closer to the sea's surface. The collection represents, in effect, a cross-section of ancient Mediterranean naval technology spread across 400 years, a museum of maritime engineering, preserved by the same catastrophe that destroyed the city it served. The ships are predominantly merchant vessels, which is consistent with Heracleon's role as a commercial port. They are broad-beamed, deep-hulled, designed for carrying cargo rather than speed. The construction techniques vary. Some are built in the Greek tradition, with edge-joined planking held together by mortise and tenon joints, while others show Egyptian construction methods, including the characteristic Egyptian technique of building hulls from planks lashed together with rope, a method that produced flexible, shallow draft vessels ideally suited for river navigation. The presence of both traditions in the same harbor, once again, speaks to the bicultural reality of Heracleon's daily life. Greek ships and Egyptian ships, side by side, in the same water. Loading and unloading the same categories of goods, operated by sailors who probably argued about the weather in 2 languages and agreed about the beer in neither. Among the ships, the divers found cargo, amphorae, the standardized ceramic shipping containers of the ancient world. The cardboard boxes of Mediterranean commerce were found in enormous quantities, some still stacked in the holds of the ships that carried them, others scattered across the harbor floor where they had been dropped or dumped or lost during loading and unloading operations. The amphorae tell a story of trade routes. Their shapes and fabrics identify their origins: Attic amphorae from mainland Greece, Chian amphorae from the island of Chios, Rhodian amphorae from Rhodes, Egyptian amphorae of local manufacture. The wine and oil they once contained are gone, consumed or evaporated millennia ago, but the containers remain, and containers, in archaeology, are often more informative than their contents. They tell you where goods came from, they tell you how they were transported, they tell you, if you know how to read them, the entire economic geography of a vanished trade network. The anchors are perhaps the most evocative of the harbor finds. Dozens of stone and lead anchors have been recovered from the site, some still attached to fragments of the ropes that once held them. An anchor is, in a sense, the most honest artifact a ship produces. It is not decorative, it is not symbolic. It is functional, purely and entirely, and its function is to hold something in place, to fix a floating thing to the earth beneath the water, to resist the pull of current and wind and tide. Finding these anchors on the sea floor of Heracleon's harbor, still resting where they were dropped by sailors who intended to raise them again but never did, is a small, quiet reminder that the sea floor is not just a repository of grand architecture and monumental statuary. It is also a record of everyday gestures, the ordinary, unremarkable act of dropping an anchor, done 1,000 times without thought, preserved this once by a catastrophe that made the ordinary permanent. The 70-plus ships in Heracleon's harbor are, collectively, one of the largest concentrations of ancient shipwrecks ever found in a single location. They are still being studied, still being documented, still yielding information about ancient construction techniques, trade patterns, and maritime technology. The work is slow. Underwater excavation is always slow, for reasons we will discuss later, but the harbor is patient. It has been holding these ships for over 2,000 years. It can hold them a little longer. Part 11. The weight of water. Water is not kind to human things. This is a general truth that applies to everything from a book left in the rain to a city left in the sea. Water corrodes metal. Water dissolves organic material. Water encourages the growth of organisms that colonize and consume whatever the water itself does not destroy. Water is, in the long run, the most patient and most thorough of all the forces that act upon the material products of human civilization, and given enough time, it will reduce almost anything to its constituent elements, scattering atoms that were once a temple or a ship or a statue of a god back into the undifferentiated soup from which they were originally assembled. And yet, water also preserves. Not everything, not forever, but under the right conditions that happen to prevail on the sea floor of Aboukir Bay water, can act as a conservator of extraordinary effectiveness, protecting objects from the very forces that would destroy them most quickly on land. The key is oxygen, or, more precisely, the absence of oxygen. In the deep silt of the harbor floor, where sediment has accumulated in dense, fine layers over centuries, the environment is anaerobic oxygen-free. And without oxygen, the biological and chemical processes that drive the decay of organic material slow to a crawl. Wood that would rot in decades on the surface can survive for millennia in anaerobic mud. Leather, rope, woven fibers, food residues, all the fragile, ephemeral materials that are the first casualties of time on land can endure, in recognizable form, in the cold, dark, oxygen-poor sediment of the sea floor. This is the paradox at the heart of Heracleion's story, and it is worth stating plainly because it is the kind of paradox that changes how you think about catastrophe. The submersion of Heracleion was a disaster. It destroyed a city. It displaced a population. It erased a living community from the surface of the earth. But the same process that accomplished this destruction also accomplished something else. It created an environment in which the physical remains of that city, its buildings, its artifacts, its ships, its offerings, its statues, its documents were preserved with a fidelity that no surface site in the Nile Delta could match. On land, Heracleion's remains would have been quarried for building stone, plundered for valuables, buried under later construction, eroded by wind and rain, and subjected to the thousand small indignities that time inflicts on everything it can reach. Underwater, none of that happened. The stone stayed where it fell, the bronze stayed where it was placed, the ships stayed where they sank, and the silt covered everything, slowly, gently, like a blanket drawn over a sleeping figure, sealing the city in a dark, quiet, airless tomb that was, paradoxically, the best possible environment for its long-term survival. The result is a site of extraordinary archaeological richness. Objects that would have disintegrated centuries ago on land are found intact on the seafloor. Wooden ship hulls, wicker baskets, organic residues in ceramic vessels, the leather fittings of anchors, rope. These materials, which terrestrial archaeologists almost never find because they simply do not survive in the open air for more than a few centuries, are present at Heracleion in quantities that are, frankly, astonishing to specialists accustomed to working with the fragmentary, incomplete, badly degraded remains that are the norm for sites of comparable age on dry land. But preservation is not the same as immunity. The seafloor is not a freezer. It is a dynamic environment, and the objects within it are subject to ongoing processes that alter and degrade them, just more slowly than they would be altered and degraded above water. Metal objects corrode, forming thick crusts of corrosion products that can obscure their original surfaces. Stone is slowly dissolved by the chemical action of salt water. Biological organisms, boring worms, encrusting shellfish, bacteria colonize every available surface, adding layers of biological material that must be carefully removed during conservation. And the sediment itself, while protective, is also a source of pressure and chemical change, compressing objects, shifting their positions, and introducing minerals that can interact with the original materials in complex ways. Conservation of underwater artifacts is, consequently, one of the most challenging and expensive aspects of underwater archaeology. An object lifted from the sea floor cannot simply be dried out and put in a display case. The sudden change in environment from cold, dark, oxygen-poor water to warm, bright, oxygen-rich air can be devastating, causing wood to shrink and crack, metal to flake, and organic materials to crumble. Every object must be stabilized, desalinated, and gradually acclimated to atmospheric conditions in a process that can take months or years depending on the material and the degree of degradation. The cost is enormous, the expertise required is rare, and the objects, while they wait, must be kept in carefully controlled environments essentially, kept wet until the conservators are ready for them. This is the weight of water in a metaphorical sense. The same substance that preserved Heracleion now imposes conditions on how it can be studied, how its artifacts can be handled, and how its story can be told. The water gives, and the water demands. It preserved the city, but it also holds the city hostage, accessible only to those with the technology, the funding, and the patience to work within the constraints that water imposes. And those constraints are considerable, as we shall see. Part 12. Gold, Bronze, and Lead. Let us talk about small things. The monumental statuary of Heracleion, the colossal pharaoh, the queen, the great Hapi, gets the attention. This is understandable. A 5-meter granite figure lying on the sea floor is photogenic in a way that few archaeological finds can match. And photographs of divers hovering over stone faces in green water have become the defining images of the site. These are the artifacts that make the front pages, that fill the museum halls, that appear on the covers of books with titles like Lost Cities of the Ancient World and Treasures from the Deep. They are, in every sense, the public face of Heracleion. But they are not the whole story. They are not even, arguably, the most important story. Because the most important story of any archaeological site is not told by its grandest artifacts, but by its smallest ones, the objects that were too insignificant to be commemorated in texts, too humble to be depicted in art, too ordinary to be noticed by anyone except the people who use them every day. These are the objects that tell you not what a civilization aspired to be, but what it actually was. Not its ideology, but its texture. Not its kings, but its kitchens. Heracleion has yielded thousands of these small objects, and collectively they constitute one of the richest collections of everyday material culture from the late period and Ptolemaic era ever recovered from a single site. Gold coins, some bearing the images of pharaohs, others inscribed in Greek, all of them evidence of the monetary economy that lubricated the city's commercial machinery. Bronze ritual instruments, sistras, offering spoons, incense burners, each one a tool used in the daily religious practices that structured the lives of Heracleion's priestly class. Lead weights, calibrated to the standard units of measure used in Egyptian and Greek trade, each one a guarantee that the scales in the customs houses were honest, or at least consistently dishonest. Ceramic oil lamps, their wicks long since consumed, their reservoirs still stained with the residue of the oil that once filled them, each one a point of light in a city that, like all ancient cities, went dark at sunset and stayed dark until dawn. Jewelry, rings, amulets, pendants, earrings, beads, the personal adornments of people whose names we will never know, worn against skin that has long since returned to the elements, found in the silt where they were dropped or lost or abandoned when their owners fled the sinking city. A ring is a peculiarly intimate artifact. It was made to fit a specific finger. It was worn against the body. It was, in many cases, a gift from a lover, a parent, a friend, a deity. Finding a ring on the seafloor of Aboukir Bay, 1,500 years after it was last worn, is an encounter with a human particular, a specific person with a specific life, reduced now to a single small object in the mud. We cannot know who wore it, we cannot know why they lost it. But we can hold it, and in holding it, we can feel the ghost of the warmth it once carried. The ceramic vessels are perhaps the most informative of all the small finds, because ceramics are the great democratic artifact of the ancient world, produced by everyone, used by everyone, discarded by everyone, and virtually indestructible by anyone. The ceramics from Heracleion include Egyptian-made vessels for cooking, storage, and ritual use, Greek-made vessels for wine, oil, and the elaborate dining practices that were central to Greek social life, and hybrid forms that show characteristics of both traditions, suggesting local production by potters who drew on both Greek and Egyptian techniques. The diversity of ceramic forms and fabrics at the site is a material record of the cultural complexity we discussed earlier, not influence, not contact, but coexistence, rendered in clay. And then there are the objects that defy easy categorization. A bronze mirror, corroded to a rich green patina, its reflective surface long since dulled, found in what may have been a domestic context. Who looked into it? What did they see? What did they think about? A set of gaming pieces, made of faience and stone, found near what appears to be a public building. Who played with them? What game did they play? Did they win? A small ceramic figurine of a cat, produced in the Egyptian style, found in a deposit that includes both Egyptian and Greek artifacts. Was it a religious object? A child's toy? A decoration? We do not know. We will probably never know. And that not knowing is, in its way, as important as any certainty, because it reminds us that the people of Heracleion were not types, not ancient Egyptians or Greek merchants in the abstract, generalized sense, but individuals, each one unique, each one irreducible, each one carrying a set of thoughts and feelings and preferences and habits that the archaeological record can gesture toward but never fully recover. The small objects of Heracleion are a reminder that behind every grand narrative of trade and empire and civilizational exchange, there were people. People who wore rings and used mirrors and played games and lit lamps against the dark. People who lived in a city that was sinking, slowly, beneath them, and who carried on with the daily business of being human until the water made that impossible. Their statues may be 5 meters tall, but their lives were measured in the same small gestures that measure ours: the lighting of a lamp, the wearing of a ring, the dropping of an anchor. These are the things that endure. On the seafloor, in the dark. Part 13. Religion below the waterline. The gods of Heracleion were numerous, demanding, and apparently indifferent to maritime catastrophe. This is not a criticism, it is an observation about the nature of ancient religion, which operated on fundamentally different premises than modern faith. The gods of Egypt did not promise to protect their worshippers from disaster. They did not guarantee safety, prosperity, or the continued existence of the cities built in their honor. What they offered was a framework, a way of understanding the world, a set of rituals that imposed order on chaos, a vocabulary of symbols and gestures that allowed human beings to feel that they were participating in something larger than themselves. Whether that participation actually accomplished anything, in the material sense, was beside the point. The point was the participation itself. The point was the act of offering, of prayer, of ritual engagement with forces that were understood to be vast, impersonal, and fundamentally unconcerned with individual human happiness. The archaeological evidence from Heracleion's temple district paints a picture of religious life that was elaborate, expensive, and conducted with impressive regularity over a period of several centuries. The offerings found in and around the Temple of Amun-Gereb include hundreds of bronze figurines, predominantly images of Osiris, the god of the dead, of resurrection, of the cyclical regeneration of life, but also images of Isis, of Horus, of Mut, of the sacred animals that populated the Egyptian divine hierarchy. These figurines were produced in workshops, probably both local and distant, and sold to worshippers who purchased them as votive offerings, gifts to the gods. deposited in the temple as expressions of piety, gratitude, or supplication. The figurines are small, generally between 10 and 30 centimeters in height, and they are made of bronze, cast using the lost wax method that was the standard technique for small metal sculpture in the ancient world. Each one represents an investment of material, of labor, of the worshipper's personal resources, and the sheer quantity of them found at the site suggests a temple that was visited regularly by a population that took its religious obligations seriously. These were not casual offerings, they were purchases, each one representing a transaction between a human being and a god, mediated by the temple institution and the priestly class that administered it. You bought the figurine, you carried it to the temple, you placed it in the designated area, probably with a prayer or a formula prescribed by the priests. And then you left, and the figurine stayed, and the god, if the god was listening, noted your devotion and responded accordingly, which is to say, inscrutably. Along with the figurines, the excavators found offering dishes, shallow ceramic and stone vessels used for presenting food, drink, or incense to the gods. They found ritual instruments, bronze implements, used in the performance of temple ceremonies, including what appear to be components of sistras, the sacred rattles that were shaken during worship to please the goddess Hathor. They found amulets, small protective charms, produced in faience and stone, in the shapes of sacred symbols, the Eye of Horus, the Jed pillar, the Ankh, the scarab. These amulets were worn on the body, carried in pouches, placed in graves, and deposited in temples, serving the dual function of personal protection and divine propitiation. The presence of Greek religious elements alongside the Egyptian ones is consistent with what we have already discussed about the bicultural nature of the city. There is evidence of cult activity associated with Aphrodite, which makes sense in a port city. Aphrodite was, among other things, a protector of sailors, and her worship was common in harbors throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The syncretism between Aphrodite and the Egyptian goddess Hathor, or between Heracles and the Egyptian god Khonsu, would have been a natural development in a city where Greek and Egyptian religious practitioners shared not just a city but, in some cases, a temple precinct. What strikes me most about the religious evidence from Heracleion is not its grandeur, though it is grand, but its persistence. The offerings span centuries. The earliest deposits date to the city's foundation period, and the latest date to the era of its decline, when the harbor was silting up and the population was dwindling and the future held nothing but water. Even then, people were still bringing offerings to the temple. Even as the city was visibly failing, its ground settling, its waterways rising, its commercial importance evaporating in the shadow of Alexandria, the priests were still performing their rituals, and the worshippers were still depositing their bronze Osiris figurines in the designated areas, and the gods were still being fed and honored and propitiated in the prescribed manner. There is something both admirable and heartbreaking about that. A city sinking, its people praying, the waters rising, the offerings continuing, faith maintained in the face of evidence that the gods were either not listening or not interested. Or perhaps, and this is the more generous interpretation, faith understood not as a transaction, I give, you protect, but as a practice, I give, and, in giving, I participate in the order of things, regardless of outcome. The people of Heracleion did not worship Amun, because Amun kept them safe. They worshipped Amun, because Amun was the king of the gods, and the king of the gods was worshipped, and that was the order of the universe, and the order of the universe did not change just because the ground beneath your feet was becoming unreliable. The offerings are still there, in the silt, around the footprint of a temple that no longer stands, still facing the direction of a god who, whatever his other qualities, did not prevent the sea from taking his house. Part 14. The Canal Network. Heracleion was a city of water long before water became its epitaph. The Canal Network that structured the city's urban plan was not an amenity. It was not a decorative feature like the canals of a modern resort. It was the city's infrastructure, its roads, its highways, its arteries. The canals connected the harbor to the interior, the commercial districts to the warehouses, the temple precinct to the river channel. Goods moved through Heracleion by water. People moved through Heracleion by water. The city was, in functional terms, a machine for moving things from the sea to the river, and the canals were the belts and gears of that machine. The archaeological evidence reveals a canal system of considerable sophistication. The main channels were wide enough to accommodate the small cargo vessels used for intra-city transport, and they were lined with stone and timber revetments to prevent erosion and maintain their dimensions. Subsidiary channels branched off from the main arteries, penetrating into the commercial and residential districts like capillaries, ensuring that no part of the city was far from water access. The system required constant maintenance, dredging, repair of revetments, management of water flow, and the presence of this infrastructure implies a civic administration capable of organizing and funding the labor needed to keep the canals operational. This was not a city that happened to have canals. This was a city that was organized around canals, designed from the ground up as a hydraulic system. The parallel with Venice is tempting, and not entirely misleading, though the differences are significant. Venice sits on a lagoon, supported by wooden pilings driven into consolidated mud. Heracleion sat on delta sediment, a softer and more treacherous foundation. Venice has survived, so far, by adapting to its aquatic environment with centuries of engineering innovation. Heracleion did not survive because the challenges it faced, subsidence, liquefaction, sea level rise, exceeded the capacity of any ancient engineering to address. But both cities share a fundamental characteristic. They were built by people who understood water, not as an obstacle, but as a medium, not as an enemy, but as a partner. People who saw the fluid landscape of a delta or a lagoon and thought not, this is uninhabitable, but this is an opportunity. The irony is, of course, considerable. Heracleon's mastery of water engineering, its canals, its harbors, its hydraulic infrastructure, was one of the reasons the city thrived. Water was its lifeblood. Water carried the trade goods that made it wealthy. Water connected it to the Nile, which connected it to the Egyptian interior, which connected it to the grain and gold and labor that powered one of the ancient world's most productive economies. Water was Heracleon's greatest asset and its closest ally, and then water killed it. Not suddenly, not violently. Water killed Heracleion the way water kills everything, slowly, patiently, with the absolute indifference of a force that has no malice because it has no consciousness. The sea rose, the ground sank. The canals, which had been the city's arteries, became conduits for the very water that was consuming it. The harbor, which had been the city's lungs, filled with sediment and then with sea. The whole elaborate hydraulic system, designed to manage water and direct it to productive ends, was overwhelmed by water that could not be managed, water that was not flowing through channels but rising from below and pressing in from the sides, water that was not serving the city but claiming it. A city built by water, on water, for water, destroyed by water. If the universe has a sense of irony, it expressed it here with particular precision. Part 15. Alexandria's Shadow. In 331 BCE, Alexander the Great, a young Macedonian king with an empire-sized ego and the military talent to match, stood on the coast of Egypt, 20 miles southwest of Heracleion, and decided to build a city. The city would be called Alexandria, because Alexander was not burdened by false modesty, and it would be designed from the ground up as the new capital of Greek Egypt, the seat of the Ptolemaic dynasty that would rule Egypt for the next 3 centuries, and the preeminent port of the eastern Mediterranean. It would have harbors, warehouses, temples, a library, a lighthouse, and all the other apparatus of a city that intended not merely to exist, but to dominate. It would be, in every sense, a statement, a declaration that the old order was being replaced by a new one. that the future of Egyptian commerce would be conducted on Greek terms, in a Greek city, under Greek administration. And Heracleion, 20 miles up the coast, took the news the way any long-established institution takes the announcement of a younger, flashier, better-funded competitor. It continued to operate. It continued to collect taxes. It continued to process trade. But something had changed. The trajectory had shifted. The center of gravity in the eastern Mediterranean was moving, and it was moving toward Alexandria. And there was nothing that Heracleion, ancient, established, embedded in a system of pharaonic commerce that was suddenly becoming obsolete, could do about it. The decline was not immediate. Heracleion did not close its gates the day Alexandria opened its harbor. The transition took decades, probably longer. The Ptolemaic administration, whatever its preference for Alexandria, could not simply shut down an existing trade infrastructure overnight. Ships still came to Heracleion. Goods still passed through its customs houses. The Temple of Amun-Gereb still received its share of tax revenue, but the flow was diminishing. Year by year, season by season, the volume of trade passing through Heracleion decreased as Alexandria absorbed a larger and larger share of the commercial traffic that had once been Heracleion's monopoly. The economic logic was straightforward. Alexandria had a better harbor. Alexandria had a direct connection to the Mediterranean that did not depend on the increasingly unreliable canopic branch of the Nile. Alexandria had the backing of the Ptolemaic state, which invested heavily in infrastructure, built the famous lighthouse at Pharos to guide ships into port, and established the administrative machinery of a purpose-built commercial capital. Alexandria had, above all, the advantage of being new, unburdened by the accumulated compromises and limitations of a city that had grown organically over centuries, free to design its systems from scratch, optimized for the economic realities of the Hellenistic world, rather than the pharaonic one that was rapidly becoming history. Heracleion had age. Heracleion had tradition. Heracleion had the Temple of Amun-Gereb and the prestige of centuries of religious authority. But prestige does not fill harbors. Tradition does not balance budgets. And the gods of Heracleion, however ancient and however powerful, did not control the trade routes. Alexandria did. And so the merchants went to Alexandria. And the ships went to Alexandria. And the money went to Alexandria. And Heracleion, slowly, steadily, imperceptibly at first, and then undeniably, began to die. The death was economic before it was physical. The city was losing its purpose before it was losing its land. By the time the subsidence accelerated and the sea began its final advance, Heracleion was already a diminished place, not abandoned, not empty, but reduced. Its population thinned, its harbor quieter, its customs houses handling a fraction of the traffic they had once processed. The physical drowning was, in a sense, merely the completion of a process that had begun with a strategic decision made by a Macedonian king 3 centuries earlier. Alexander did not drown Heracleion, but he made its drowning irrelevant. By the time the city went under, the world had already moved on. History tends to remember the successor and forget the predecessor. We know Alexandria. We study Alexandria. We marvel at Alexandria's library, Alexandria's lighthouse, Alexandria's intellectual and cultural legacy. Heracleion, which held the role that Alexandria would inherit, which controlled the trade that Alexandria would absorb, which served the function that Alexandria would perform more efficiently and more profitably, Heracleion we forgot for 1,200 years, until the sea gave it back. There is a parable in there about what we value and what we discard, about the cruelty of obsolescence and the convenience of forgetting, but I will leave it unstated. The facts, I think, speak clearly enough. Part 16. The Archaeology of Underwater Work. Here is a question that visitors to museum exhibitions of Heracleion's treasures rarely ask, though it is the most important practical question there is. What does it actually take to excavate a city beneath the sea? The answer is more than you think. More money, more time, more patience, more discomfort, and more logistical complexity than any comparable excavation on land. Underwater archaeology is not simply archaeology that happens to be wet. It is a fundamentally different discipline, operating under constraints that transform every aspect of the work: the pace, the methodology, the documentation, the physical demands on the excavators, and the sheer volume of resources required to accomplish what would be, on land, a relatively straightforward task. Begin with the most basic constraint: time. A diver working at the depths typical of the Heracleion site, 6 to 10 meters, can remain underwater for extended periods without decompression concerns, which is a significant advantage over deeper sites. But even at these relatively shallow depths, dive time is limited by air supply. By cold, the Mediterranean in the diving season is not freezing, but it is not warm, and prolonged immersion saps body heat steadily. By fatigue, and by the simple physiological reality that the human body is not designed to operate underwater for hours at a stretch. A typical working dive at Heracleion lasts perhaps 2 to 3 hours, after which the diver must surface, warm up, rest, and either dive again later in the day or wait until the following day. The effective working time on the sea floor is a fraction of what it would be on a terrestrial site, where archaeologists can work from dawn to dusk with nothing more exotic than sunscreen and a hat. Then there is visibility. We have discussed this already, but it bears repeating in a practical context. The silt at Heracleion is fine and easily disturbed. The act of excavation itself, brushing sediment away from an artifact, fanning silt from a surface, using an airlift, a suction device that removes loose sediment, stirs up the water column and reduces visibility, sometimes to zero. Imagine trying to excavate a delicate artifact in a room where every time you brush the dirt away, the room fills with fog so thick you cannot see your own hands. Now imagine doing that while wearing a mask that limits your peripheral vision, breathing apparatus that makes every movement more effortful, and gloves that reduce your tactile sensitivity. That is underwater excavation. Documentation, the lifeblood of archaeology, the process by which raw discovery is transformed into scientific knowledge, is exponentially more difficult underwater. On land, an archaeologist can sketch a plan, take a photograph, measure distances with a tape, and write notes in a field notebook. Underwater, every one of these actions requires specialized equipment and techniques. Photography requires waterproof cameras and strobes, and the images are affected by the color filtering properties of water, which absorbs red light preferentially and gives everything a blue-green cast that must be corrected in post-processing. Measurement requires fixed reference points, grids, baselines, survey markers that must be established on the sea floor and maintained against the constant, slow movement of sediment and current. Notes cannot be written on paper underwater. Divers use waterproof slates or underwater writing boards, which are cumbersome and limited in the amount of information they can record. In recent years, photogrammetry, the creation of three-dimensional digital models from overlapping photographs, has revolutionized underwater documentation. But the technique requires hundreds or thousands of images taken from carefully planned angles, and the processing is computationally intensive. And then there is the sheer physical difficulty. Working underwater is exhausting. Every movement requires more energy than the same movement on land, because the diver is fighting water resistance and managing buoyancy. Tasks that would be trivial on the surface, lifting a small stone, brushing silt from a surface, operating a hand tool, become significant physical efforts underwater. The cold drains energy. The equipment encumbers. The breathing apparatus, while life-sustaining, imposes a constant low-level respiratory demand that compounds the fatigue of physical labor. Divers who work the Heracleion site describe the work as simultaneously meditative and grueling long periods of careful, gentle, slow-motion excavation, interrupted by moments of intense physical effort when heavy objects must be moved or secured. Goddio's team has developed over more than 2 decades of continuous work, a methodology that manages these constraints as effectively as any underwater operation in the world. The team includes professional divers, archaeologists trained in underwater techniques, conservators, geologists, and technical support staff. The excavation season runs annually, typically for several weeks during the summer months, when weather and sea conditions are most favorable. The work proceeds in carefully planned stages: survey, mapping, selective excavation, artifact recovery, documentation, each one building on the data gathered in previous seasons. The funding for all of this comes from a combination of sources, including the Hilti Foundation, the European Institute for Underwater Archaeology, and partnerships with museums and cultural institutions. The cost of a single season of underwater excavation at Heracleion is, by any standard, substantial. The equipment, the vessels, the personnel, the conservation facilities, the administrative overhead of an international archaeological project operating in Egyptian waters, under the supervision of the Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities. This is not cheap science. This is not a project that can be sustained by a single grant or a single generous donor. It requires ongoing, multi-institutional commitment, year after year, for decades, and it has been sustained, remarkably, for more than 20 years. The work continues. The city continues to reveal itself, one careful dive at a time. And with each season, the picture becomes a little clearer, a little more detailed, a little more complete, not quickly, never quickly, at the pace of water, which is to say, at the pace of patience itself. Part 17. Looting the seafloor. Who owns a sunken city? The question sounds simple. It is not, and the answer, or rather, the constellation of competing, contradictory, passionately defended non-answers that currently constitute the state of international debate on the subject, tells you a great deal about the politics of cultural heritage, the legacy of colonialism, and the deeply uncomfortable relationship between the nations that possess archaeological sites and the nations that possess the technology and funding to excavate them. Heracleion lies in Egyptian territorial waters. Under Egyptian law, and under the broadly accepted principles of international cultural heritage law, the site and everything in it belongs to Egypt. This is clear. This is not seriously disputed by anyone involved in the excavation. The artifacts recovered from Heracleion are the property of the Egyptian state, managed by the Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities. And any exhibition of those artifacts outside of Egypt occurs with the permission and under the supervision of the Egyptian government. But the excavation itself is conducted by a French-led team funded by a Liechtenstein-based foundation, using technology developed in Europe, supported by institutional partnerships that span multiple countries. The expertise, the equipment, and the money come from outside Egypt. The site is in Egypt. The discoveries are Egyptian. The capacity to make those discoveries is, largely, European. This creates a dynamic that is not quite colonial. No one is stealing anything. No one is claiming sovereignty. No one is loading artifacts onto ships and sailing them to London or Paris without permission. But it is not quite equal either. The power dynamics are real, even when the intentions are good. And they are, by most accounts, good. Goddio and his team have maintained a collaborative relationship with the Egyptian authorities for decades. The institutional framework, IEASM, working in partnership with the Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities, later the Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities, has been remarkably stable. Considering the political upheavals that Egypt has experienced during the period of the excavation, including the revolution of 2011 and its aftermath, the artifacts stay in Egypt. The publications are co-authored. The data is shared. End quote. This is, as international archaeological collaborations go, a model of relatively equitable practice. Relatively. The uncomfortable truth is that underwater archaeology, more than almost any other branch of the discipline, is dependent on resources that most nations with underwater heritage do not possess. Egypt is not a poor country, but it does not have a fleet of underwater survey vessels, a cadre of trained underwater archaeologists, or the specialized conservation facilities that the excavation of a site like Heracleion requires. These things are expensive, and they require decades of institutional development that Egypt, with its vast terrestrial archaeological heritage demanding constant attention and funding, has not been in a position to prioritize. The result is a situation in which the nations with the most underwater heritage, Egypt, Greece, Turkey, the countries of the Mediterranean, and the global South, are often dependent on nations with the most underwater capability, France, the United States, the United Kingdom, and the wealthy foundations that operate from European tax havens to excavate and study their own submerged past. This is not a scandal. It is a structural inequity, the kind of asymmetry that characterizes much of the relationship between the developed and developing worlds in matters of science, technology, and cultural heritage. It is worth naming, not to assign blame, but to acknowledge that the story of Heracleon's discovery is not purely a story of scientific triumph. It is also a story about who has the resources to do the discovering, and what that implies about whose past gets recovered and whose does not. Beyond the politics, there is the more straightforward threat of looting. Underwater archaeological sites, particularly those in shallow water close to shore, are vulnerable to unauthorized exploitation by recreational divers, commercial salvors, and organized antiquities traffickers. The legal protections are inadequate. The enforcement is difficult. The temptation is, for some, irresistible ancient gold coins, bronze figurines, and other portable artifacts from underwater sites can command high prices on the illicit antiquities market. And the detection of underwater theft is vastly more difficult than its terrestrial equivalent. You cannot put a fence around the sea floor. You cannot install security cameras in 10 meters of salt water. The site is out there, in Aboukir Bay, every day, whether or not the excavation team is present, and the only thing protecting it from unauthorized access is the law, the difficulty of working underwater, and the hope that the people who know where it is also care enough to leave it alone. Hope is not, historically, a reliable conservation strategy. The ongoing excavation, the publication of results, and the exhibition of artifacts all serve, in part, a protective function. A site that is known, documented, and actively worked is harder to loot than one that is forgotten and unmonitored. Goddio's work has, in this sense, a dual purpose. It recovers knowledge, and it asserts custody. It says, in effect, this place is being watched. This place is being cared for. This place has people who are paying attention. Whether that is enough, in the long run, remains to be seen. The seafloor is large, the nights are dark, and the things down there are very, very valuable. Part 18. What we still don't know. After more than 2 decades of excavation, Heracleion has revealed temples, harbors, statues, ships, coins, inscriptions, ritual objects, and the general outlines of a city that was once one of the most important in the Mediterranean world. And we have barely scratched the surface. Or rather, barely scratched the seafloor, which in this case amounts to the same thing. The excavation has focused, understandably, on the monumental center of the city, the Temple District, the main harbor, the areas of greatest architectural and artifactual density. This is standard archaeological practice. You begin with the most visible, most productive areas and work outward. But the result is that our picture of Heracleion is heavily weighted toward its public, ceremonial, and commercial zones. We know the temple. We know the harbor. We know the customs infrastructure. We know, in broad terms, what the city's official face looked like, the face it presented to the gods and to the foreign merchants who came to trade. What we do not know, or know only in the vaguest terms, is what the rest of the city looked like, the residential districts. The neighborhoods where ordinary people lived, the sailors, the dock workers, the craftsmen, the tavern keepers, the fishermen, the priests' families, the enslaved laborers who almost certainly constituted a significant portion of the city's population. Where did they live? What did their houses look like? How were their streets organized? What did they eat? How did they bury their dead? These questions are not trivial. They are, in many ways, the most important questions you can ask about any ancient city, because they concern not the exceptional, but the typical, not the powerful, but the ordinary, not the monumental, but the domestic. The cemeteries of Heracleion, if they exist in an identifiable form on the seafloor, have not yet been located. This is a significant gap. In Egyptian archaeology, cemeteries are among the most informative sources of evidence about a population, its size, its health, its diet, its ethnic composition, its social structure, its religious beliefs as practiced by individuals rather than institutions. The absence of cemetery data from Heracleion means that entire dimensions of the city's history remain closed to us. The outskirts of the city, the suburban zones, the agricultural areas, the transitional spaces where urban settlement shaded into the countryside, are also largely unexplored. These areas, which in any ancient city contained a significant proportion of the population and the productive infrastructure, workshops, farms, processing facilities, are archaeologically less dramatic than the monumental center, but potentially more informative about the economic and social realities of daily life. And then there are the questions that the existing evidence raises but does not answer. How large was Heracleion's population at its peak? Estimates vary widely, and the archaeological evidence is insufficient to resolve the question with any precision. What was the city's relationship to other settlements on the Canopic branch? Was it an isolated urban center, or the largest node in a network of interdependent towns and villages? How did the city's population change over time? Was the decline gradual or punctuated by episodes of sudden depopulation, perhaps triggered by subsidence events or epidemic disease? What happened to the people who left? Where did they go? Did they carry their traditions with them, or did they assimilate into the populations of the cities that received them? We do not know. We do not yet know. The distinction matters. We do not know implies a permanent limit. We do not yet know implies a frontier, a boundary that is current but movable, a horizon that recedes as we advance toward it. The Heracleion excavation is ongoing. Each season adds to the picture. Each dive brings new data. The city is still giving up its secrets, reluctantly, in the way that all buried things give up their secrets, not all at once, not willingly, but incrementally, in response to sustained, patient, carefully directed effort. The seafloor is a library. We have read the title page and the table of contents. The chapters remain. Part 19. The silence. Down there. There is something about underwater ruins that affects people differently than ruins on land. This is not a matter of archaeological content. A fallen column is a fallen column, whether it lies in the dirt of a Roman forum or the silt of a Mediterranean harbor. A broken wall is a broken wall. A scattered artifact field is a scattered artifact field. The information content, the data that an archaeologist can extract, is comparable, and in many cases, the underwater material is better preserved than its terrestrial equivalent. There is no rational reason why a statue lying on the sea floor should feel different from a statue lying in a field. And yet it does. And understanding why it does is, I think, part of understanding what Heracleion means, not as an archaeological site, but as an experience, as an encounter with something that reaches past the intellect and touches something else, something older and less verbal, something that responds to darkness and depth and the muffled quality of sound in water. Part of it is the visual. Ruins on land are seen in daylight, in open air, in a context that is familiar and manageable. They are part of the landscape. You can walk around them, touch them, sit on them, eat your lunch next to them. They are, for all their age, domesticated. They belong to the world you know. Ruins, underwater, are not like this. They exist in a world that is not yours, a world of filtered light and limited visibility, a world where your body is not at home, where you are a visitor sustained by technology, where the colors are wrong, and the silence is wrong, and the scale is wrong. A temple column in a Roman forum is impressive. A temple column lying in green water, encrusted with marine growth, visible only in the narrow beam of your dive light, looming out of the murk, like a memory that you are not sure is yours. That is something else. That is not impressive. That is uncanny. Part of it is the silence. Land-based ruins exist in a world of sound, wind, birdsong, traffic, the voices of other visitors, the crunch of gravel underfoot. These sounds anchor you in the present. They remind you that you are alive, that the world is alive, that the ruin you are looking at is an anomaly, a dead thing in a living landscape. Underwater, those sounds are gone. The only sound is your own breathing, amplified by the regulator into a rhythmic hiss and bubble that becomes, after a while, hypnotic. The silence of the sea floor is not the silence of a library or a church. It is a silence that has weight. A silence that presses on you from all directions, like the water itself, a silence that you are immersed in rather than surrounded by. In that silence, a ruin does not feel like a dead thing. It feels like a sleeping thing, a thing that has withdrawn from the world but has not left it, a thing that is still here, still present, still occupying its space in the universe, just doing so very, very quietly. And part of it is the darkness. Even in shallow water, even at 10 meters, the light is different. Sunlight, filtered through the water column, loses its warmth and its specificity. It becomes generalized, diffuse, greenish, colors fade, edges soften. The world takes on the quality of a photograph left in the rain, legible, but dimmed, as if reality itself has been turned down a notch. In this light, a stone face looks not like a carving, but like a vision. A wall looks not like architecture, but like a boundary between the known and the unknown. The darkness beyond your light's reach is not empty. It is full of things you have not yet seen, things that are there whether you look at them or not, things that have been there for 1,000 years, waiting in the dark, with a patience that only stone and water can sustain. Divers who have worked the Heracleion site describe the experience in terms that are notably consistent. They use words like dreamlike, meditative, humbling. They describe the moment when the ruins first become visible, when the dive light sweeps across a surface and resolves it into something recognizably made, recognizably intentional, recognizably human, as one of the most powerful experiences of their careers. Not because the artifacts are more impressive than what they might find on land, but because the context, the water, the silence, the darkness, the sense of being somewhere you are not supposed to be, transforms the encounter into something that is not quite rational, something that operates on a register below language. This is not mysticism. It is not superstition. It is the simple, physiological reality that the human brain processes underwater environments differently than terrestrial ones. The reduced sensory input, the altered light, the physical sensation of suspension, of weightlessness, of being held by the water rather than supported by the ground. These conditions produce a state of consciousness that is measurably different from normal waking awareness, calmer, more focused, more receptive, more inclined to awe. And when the thing you encounter in that state is a 1,200-year-old statue of a god, resting in the silt with its eyes open and its lips curved in a faint, knowing smile, the effect is not educational, it is transformative. The silence down there is not an absence, it is a presence, and it speaks, in its way, more eloquently than any inscription. Part 20. The night the harbor went dark. Mini documentary. A speculative reconstruction. Let me try something different now. Let me try to put you there. Not in the archaeological present, with its dive lights and regulators and photogrammetric surveys, but in the historical past. on a night when the city was still alive, barely, and the ground moved. It is the 2nd century BCE, or perhaps the 1st. The dating is imprecise, as dating always is for events that no one recorded because everyone was too busy surviving them. Heracleion is still inhabited, but it is not the city it was. The harbor, once crowded with Greek merchantmen and Egyptian river barges, is quieter now. Alexandria has been absorbing the trade for generations, and the ships that once queued to enter Heracleion's port now sail past it, 20 miles down the coast, to the newer, deeper, better connected harbor that Alexander's architects designed and the Ptolemies maintained. The customs houses are still operating, but the revenue is a fraction of what it was. The Temple of Amun-Gereb still stands, still functions, still receives its offerings, but the priesthood is smaller, the festivals less lavish, the sense of divine favor less certain. The city is also, in a way that its inhabitants can sense but not articulate, lower than it used to be. The quays that once stood comfortably above the waterline now flood at high tide. The canals, which were designed with a certain freeboard between water level and street level, now seem to reach higher, to spread further, to drain more slowly after storms. The foundations of buildings have cracked in places, hairline fractures that appear after the not infrequent tremors that shake the delta, fractures that the builders repair with new mortar that does not quite match the old. The ground is settling. Everyone knows this, in the way that people know uncomfortable truths, not as a stated fact, but as a background awareness, a low hum of unease that accompanies daily life without disrupting it. And then, on this night, the hum becomes a roar. The earthquake, when it comes, is not the kind that topples buildings in a single convulsive instant. It is the kind that is almost worse, a sustained, rolling tremor that lasts for what feels like minutes, that shakes the saturated soil of the delta in long, nauseating waves, that does not so much destroy structures as undermine them, liquefying the ground beneath their foundations and allowing the buildings to settle, tilt, and crack under their own weight. The technical term is liquefaction, and it is one of the most destructive phenomena that can affect a city built on waterlogged sediment. The soil, shaken by the seismic waves, loses its cohesion and behaves, temporarily, like a liquid. Anything resting on it, walls, columns, statues, entire buildings, sinks into the softened ground as if the earth has decided, just for a moment, to stop being solid. In the temple district, the colossal statue of the pharaoh, 5 meters of red granite, weighing tons, tips backward as the ground beneath its pedestal gives way. It falls slowly, almost gracefully, its descent cushioned by the softened earth, and comes to rest on its back with its face turned toward the sky. Nearby, the statue of Hapi follows, its massive form settling into the liquefied soil with a strange, ponderous gentleness, like a body lowering itself into a bath. The temple walls crack. Stone blocks shift. The stele, the great inscribed slab, bearing the Decree of Naukratis, topples from its position and falls face down into the mud, pressing its hieroglyphic text against the earth in an accidental act of self-preservation. In the harbor, the water surges. Not a wave, exactly, but a displacement, the water responding to the sudden settling of the land, rushing in to fill spaces that were not there a moment ago. Ships at anchor lurch and grind against each other. Mooring ropes snap. Smaller vessels capsize. In the Canal Network, the water level rises abruptly as the land around the canals sinks, sending sheets of water across streets that were, moments before, dry. The sound is wrong, not the crashing roar of a tsunami or a storm surge, but a thick, heavy, sucking sound, the sound of water filling space that solid ground has just vacated. The people. We must not forget the people. In the houses and workshops and taverns of the residential districts, the districts we have not yet excavated, the districts whose very location on the sea floor is still uncertain, people are experiencing this as terror. The ground is moving, the water is rising, the walls of their homes are cracking, the night is dark, because the oil lamps have been knocked from their stands by the shaking, and in the darkness the sounds are amplified, the groaning of settling masonry, the rush of water, the cries of neighbors, the barking of dogs, the crash of something large falling somewhere close. Some of them leave, that night or the next morning, when the shaking has stopped and the water has settled to its new, higher level. Some of them gather what they can carry and walk away from the city that their families have lived in for generations. They walk to higher ground, to the south, to the places that are not sinking, to the villages and towns of the delta interior, or they take boats down the coast to Alexandria, where there is work, where there is solid ground, where the future, for whatever it is worth, seems to be headed. Others stay, because the damage, while severe, is not total. The buildings are cracked, but many are still standing. The temple is damaged, but not destroyed. The harbor is operational, if diminished. The canals still function, at least some of them. Life can continue, after a fashion. The city can be repaired, after a fashion. It is still a city. It is still, just barely, a viable place to live. Until the next event, and the one after that, and the one after that, each one a little worse than the last, each one sinking the city a little further, raising the water a little higher, eroding the foundations a little more. The departure of the population is not a single exodus but a slow leaching, a gradual loss of people and energy and hope, spread across decades or centuries, until one day, and no one records which day, because by then there is no one left to record anything the last person leaves, and the city belongs to the water, and the water closes over it, and that is that. The harbor goes dark, the last lamp goes out, the sea moves in, inch by inch, tide by tide, and takes what was always, in some geological sense, its own, and the silence begins. Part 21. The Canal of Memory. There is a particular kind of forgetting that happens not through violence or censorship, but through indifference. It is the most common form of historical erasure, and it is the most complete. A city burned by invaders is remembered because the burning is recorded, lamented, mythologized. A city erased by decree, its name chiseled from monuments, its records destroyed, is paradoxically remembered, because the act of erasure itself leaves traces, the suspicious blank spaces, the chiseled-out cartouches, the absences that shout. But a city that simply ceases to matter, that drops out of the conversation because the conversation has moved on, that fades from memory, not because anyone wanted to forget it, but because no one had a reason to remember that city, disappears completely. No record of its destruction, no myth of its fall, just silence where a name used to be. Heracleion suffered this third kind of forgetting. It was not burned. It was not deliberately erased. It was obsolesced. It was overtaken by a newer, shinier, more efficient version of itself and the world, with the ruthless pragmatism that characterizes all economic systems, redirected its attention and its resources to the successor, and let the predecessor fade. The ancient sources did not stop mentioning Heracleion because something dramatic happened. They stopped mentioning it because nothing dramatic was happening anymore. The city had become uninteresting. And in the ancient world, as in the modern one, being uninteresting was a death sentence more final than any military defeat. This is, if you think about it, the most common fate of cities. Not destruction, but irrelevance. Not catastrophe, but decline. The world is full of places that were once important and are now not former capitals, former trading hubs, former centers of culture and commerce that lost their reason for being and shrank to towns, to villages, to names on maps that prompt the question, what happened there? The answer, almost always, is something else happened somewhere else. The routes shifted, the river moved, the harbor silted up, a competitor emerged, and the city, unable to adapt to a changed world, faded. Not with a bang, not even with a whimper. just with a slow, quiet diminution, like a candle burning down in a room where no one is watching. Heracleon's forgetting was made absolute by its submersion. A city that merely declines can still be visited, can still be pointed at, can still serve as a cautionary tale or a nostalgic reference. A city that sinks beneath the sea cannot even do that. It is not just forgotten, it is inaccessible. It exists in a place that human beings cannot casually visit, a place that requires technology, funding, expertise, and intention. You cannot stumble upon Heracleion the way you might stumble upon the ruins of a hilltop fortress or a roadside temple. You have to go looking for it, deliberately, with equipment, and you have to know, or at least suspect, that it is there. For 1,200 years, no one did. The memory of Heracleion was not maintained by any continuous tradition. No local community preserved stories of the sunken city. No fisherman told tales of walls glimpsed through clear water on calm days. The city sank slowly enough that its departure was not traumatic enough to generate lasting oral tradition, and it sank completely enough that its physical remains were not visible from the surface. It was, for all practical purposes, gone. A name in old books, a scholarly curiosity, a question without an answer. And then the answer appeared, lying on its back in the mud, 5 meters tall, carved in red granite, with a faint smile on its stone face. And the world, presented with the evidence, did what it always does when confronted with something it had forgotten. It acted surprised, and then it acted as if it had known all along. Part 22. The uncomfortable parallel. I said earlier that I would not moralize, and I will not, but I will note something, because it would be dishonest not to. Heracleion was a coastal city built on soft, low-lying land at the edge of a delta, and it was destroyed by a combination of subsidence, rising sea levels, and the geological instability of the ground on which it stood. These are not exotic forces. They are not ancient forces. They are present forces, active, measurable, ongoing forces that are currently affecting coastal cities around the world. From Bangkok to Jakarta to Miami to Shanghai. Cities built on deltas and floodplains and reclaimed land that is, in geological terms, about as stable as the ground beneath Heracleion. The parallels are not metaphorical. They are physical. The processes that drowned Heracleion, subsidence of unconsolidated sediment, the compounding effects of sea level rise, the vulnerability of delta cities to the combined pressures of sinking land and rising water are the same processes that are currently threatening the Mekong Delta, the Ganges, Brahmaputra Delta, the Mississippi Delta, and dozens of other low-lying coastal regions where hundreds of millions of people live. The timescales are different. The causes are different. The anthropogenic acceleration of sea level rise through climate change adds a dimension to the modern crisis that the ancient Heracleionites did not face. But the underlying physics, the simple, brutal arithmetic of land going down while water comes up, is identical. Heracleion did not sink because its inhabitants did anything wrong. They did not cause the subsidence. They did not raise the sea level. They did not trigger the earthquakes. They built a city in the best location available to them, using the best technology available to them, and they thrived there for centuries. And then geological forces beyond their control or comprehension slowly took it away from them. They adapted as long as they could. They repaired what they could. They stayed as long as staying made sense. And then they left. Because the alternative was to drown. I will not draw the parallel explicitly. I trust you to draw it yourselves. I will only note that if Heracleion's story has a lesson, it is not a comforting one. It is simply this: the ground beneath your feet is not as permanent as it feels. The water at the edge of your city is not as far away as it looks. And the forces that act on coastlines, on deltas, on the thin, uncertain boundary between land and sea, do not respect the distinction between ancient and modern, between Egyptian and American, between then and now. The sea does not care what century it is. The sea only cares about elevation, and the math, for some cities, is not going well. Part 23. The Architecture of Patience. Let us return, for a moment, to the seafloor. Not to the archaeology, not to the artifacts or the inscriptions or the trade routes, just to the seafloor itself. To the simple physical reality of what is down there and what it looks like and what it feels like to be in its presence, even if that presence is mediated by a screen rather than a mask. The ruins of Heracleion, as they exist today, are not dramatic in the way that land-based ruins can be dramatic. There are no towering columns against a blue sky, no arched doorways framing desert vistas, no walls standing tall enough to suggest the buildings they once were. The drama of underwater ruins is quieter than that. It is the drama of horizontality, of things that were once vertical, now lying flat, of things that were once upright, now resting on their sides, of a city that has been, in effect, laid down to sleep by the slow, patient pressure of water and silt and time. The statues lie on their backs. The walls have fallen outward, their stones displaced but not scattered, as if they collapsed gently rather than violently. The columns lie in rows, like felled trees, their drums still roughly aligned, their capitals still approximately adjacent. The overall impression is not of destruction, but of subsidence, of a city that did not break but settled, that did not explode but deflated, that sank into the seafloor the way a heavy object sinks into soft ground. Slowly, steadily, with a kind of ponderous inevitability that is, in its way, more unsettling than any sudden catastrophe. And over all of it, the silt. Fine gray-brown, almost luminous in the beam of a dive light, drifting in slow clouds when disturbed, settling again with the patient deliberation of something that has all the time in the world. The silt is the seafloor's way of covering things, not hiding them. Exactly, the outlines of walls and statues and structural features are still visible, raised above the surrounding sediment like the contours of a body beneath a sheet, but softening them, muting them, transforming the hard edges of human construction into something rounder, gentler, less insistent. The silt does not erase. The silt translates. It takes the sharp language of architecture and renders it in the softer vocabulary of geology, turning walls into ridges, columns into mounds, a city into a landscape. And in this landscape, the artifacts rest with a composure that feels almost deliberate. The bronze figurines of Osiris, green with centuries of patina, still standing in the positions where they were placed as offerings. The ceramic vessels, intact, their glazes dulled, but their forms unchanged. The anchors, lying in the harbor silt, still attached to fragments of rope that have lasted 2,000 years because the mud sealed them before the bacteria could consume them. Everything is still. Everything is calm. Everything is waiting, with the infinite patience of things that have no concept of time, for someone to come and notice. This is what the seafloor offers that the surface world does not. Stillness. Absolute, enforced, unbreakable stillness. On land, ruins are surrounded by life, by wind and weather, by vegetation, by the constant noise and movement of a world that has not stopped. On the sea floor, the ruins are surrounded by silence and the slow drift of particles through water, and the effect is not desolation, but serenity. A strange, melancholy, profoundly peaceful serenity, like the expression on the face of the granite pharaoh, gazing upward through the water with the composed calm of a figure that has accepted its situation and found, in that acceptance, something resembling rest. The city sleeps. It has been sleeping for 1,200 years. And when the divers visit, when the lights sweep across the stones and the cameras record and the hands carefully brush the silt from a surface that has not been touched since the 8th century, the city does not wake. It merely allows itself to be seen for a moment before the silt settles again and the light withdraws and the silence reasserts itself and the dark returns. It is an architecture of patience. and there is nothing on the surface of the earth quite like it.